Hello everyone. With this presentation, we will be going over the secondary application. So let's start with the purpose of the secondary application. First and foremost, the medical schools are trying to get to know each applicant better. They're looking to see if you have the characteristics and the experiences that they're really looking for, and also whether or not you value the same things as you think about your career in medicine. It's also important for the schools to begin to determine the fit between you and the school. So they're looking to see, are we lining up well? Are we able to see this person as a potential member of our entering class? The schools also use secondaries in order to gauge your interest. So in some cases you might say, well, if I wasn't interested, I wouldn't have applied, which is certainly true, but maybe sometimes people kind of throw in a few extra schools, or maybe they didn't take a ton of time in creating their school list and cast a really wide net. This secondary application is an opportunity for the medical schools to see how interested you are. So if all of your answers are really generic, that could be a sign for them that you're not super interested. If you receive a secondary application in July and you don't submit it again or return it to them until November, that can also be a sign for them that maybe you're not terribly interested in their program. The schools often want to check for any connections, meaning do you have any parents, grandparents who also attended their institution? Have you ever worked with any of their faculty? So sometimes this question is asked on the secondary application as well. And then finally, the secondaries are there to make money for the medical school, and we're only being slightly flippant in this response. We know that you already spent a whole lot of money to send your AMCAS application in. However, that money all goes to AMCAS. So far the medical schools have not only not received money from you, but they have also paid AMCAS for the privilege of using their services. So if you get a secondary that's basically confirm your address and send us a check, that's all the medical school needs from you. So it's nothing to worry about, but it is just a financial reality that this is now where the medical schools are getting their money. So this is a big question. When will you receive the secondary applications? AMCAS will start transmitting all applicant data to the medical schools beginning on June 28th, and they will then continue to send applicant data on a daily basis. So for those of you that may have submitted right away May 30th, your application materials have just been sitting at AMCAS, and they are basically working to make sure that they have a large number of applications verified and ready to go before transmitting that data to the medical schools. One thing to clarify is that whether you are verified or not, come June 28th, when the data gets sent to the medical schools, even if all you have so far is a name and an email address, and they haven't yet verified your application, your contact information will still be sent to the schools. So you may still get secondaries even without being verified by AMCAS. So depending on the school's preference though, there are other things that may affect the timing for your secondaries. First is if they basically do an automatic computer feed. So as soon as the data hits their school, they know what your name is, they know what your email address is, and they might automatically send you a secondary with really no human engagement in that process. They may do a preliminary screen. So the preliminary screen may be, okay, if the GPA and the MCAT is reasonable, we'll automatically send them a secondary. At some schools that are state-based, if they only accept residents of their own state, they may screen out anybody that doesn't fit the bill. And so that screen might mean that your secondary is a little bit delayed because there is some human processing with that. I would say, just so nobody panics right off the bat, most schools that do a numbers screen, it's still a pretty wide threshold. So for example, they might screen out anybody that has a GPA below a 3.0, and then also screen out maybe based on an MCAT score that's below a 500 or maybe even a 505. So they cast a really wide net. It's not to say that they do a first screen and cut anybody that doesn't have at least a 3.7 and a 5.16 on the MCAT. So they still cast a pretty wide net there. And then there are some schools that do a pretty substantial screening of your primary application before sending a secondary. So they're going to be reading your full application, personal statements. If your letters of recommendation are there, they're going to be reading those, and then they'll determine a secondary from that point on. The thing that is somewhat nice about those schools, although you need to wait longer for the secondary, is typically if they send you a secondary, your odds of getting an interview are much higher because they've done a more thorough screen for that secondary application. A couple of other factors to consider in terms of the timeline. First of all, as you may suspect, right about now, which is about July, is when many medical schools are welcoming their next class. So the entering class of 2019 is typically arriving to medical schools anytime between early July into early August. The same admissions committee members that will be paying attention to your application are also responsible for getting that class in. So sometimes the medical schools, even though AMCAS sends June 28th, if the medical school doesn't have their secondary ready, or they're just not in a space work-wise yet that they can really think about it, you might not get a secondary application for a couple weeks still. It's nothing to worry about, because keep in mind that whatever timeline that school has is the timeline you're going to be going off of. So if they don't submit their secondaries to their applicants until July 15th, if you send it back within a week, you are still on the early side for their process, even if you may have sent it back to other schools a couple weeks prior. So it's nothing to panic about. Just make sure that all of your contact information is correct on your AMCAS, that you've got your email address right. By and large, the secondaries are going to be coming through email. So make sure you're checking your filters and not missing anything that way. So a couple of comments about how to approach the secondary application. It's a little bit like peeling an onion. If you think about your primary application kind of being your glossy, super polished, best foot forward kind of approach, with the secondaries, they're asking for another layer. They want to get to know you a little bit better and get a little bit more personal with you. It is okay to repeat things like experiences or opportunities from the primary application, but you want to add something new. So sometimes students will say, you know, the secondary asked for my most significant clinical experience, and I already wrote about that in my primary. Do I have to make something up, or what do I do? You never want to copy and paste directly from your primary application. They will see that very quickly and they will not be amused. But you could take that same experience and maybe give it a new dimension. Maybe it's the same overall experience, but you talk about a different patient in the secondary than you did in the primary. So you can repeat experiences and opportunities. You just always want to give them a little bit something new or something different to learn from that experience. Your tone should be the same as the personal statement. So you want to keep striking that balance between personal and professional. It is important to be authentic. So don't try to kind of engineer your answers or think about, well, what would they want me to say here? The more authentic you are, the better the school is able to determine if you're a good fit. And similarly, the better you'll be able to determine, am I a good fit for this school? If you give them a fake you when it comes to the secondary, and then you show up to interview, maybe you continue to be fake, maybe now you're real, they might have concerns about why you might seem like two different people between the secondary and the interview. The other thing too is if you're kind of being fake through the whole thing, how are you going to know if this is a school that really is an authentic fit for you? So you do want to be as realistic and as authentic as you can be. However, at the risk of being a little bit jokey, think about that first date test. Reread your essays, reread the information that you've submitted, and kind of think about, you know, if I'm sitting on a date and somebody gives me this answer, somebody tells me this about themselves, is that great? Have they presented it in a way that is interesting and lets me, you know, kind of think, well, this is a really, really cool person, and maybe they've been through some struggle, but they've gotten through it, or they've come out stronger on the other side? Or do I want to run out of the restaurant? So you want to make sure that whatever you present, you're doing it in still a relatively, you know, thoughtful, not raising any flags kind of way. So some common questions that you might receive. Why this school? So sometimes the medical school will give you a mission statement. Sometimes they'll just say, tell us about your interest in the school. You definitely want to say something exacting. You don't want to just give kind of general platitudes about, I'm looking for a school that balances research and clinical. You don't want to give an answer that could be applied to 20 different medical schools. And the admissions committees are pretty savvy at figuring that out. So you'd want to connect to their patient population. You'd want to connect to a part of their curriculum, a clinical experience that they might be able to give their students. That's something that will be very important. And as much as possible, you also want to say the school name. Just make sure you double check that 37 times. First, to make sure that you're spelling it correctly, and then also to make sure that the right school is on the right application. Location, meaning, you're in the city of Chicago, should not be a primary factor. It's certainly something that you could kind of add in there at the end, but you don't want to say to a medical school, I really am interested in staying in Chicago, so that's why I'm applying to your school. There's 6 medical schools in Chicago. That doesn't help them to understand why their school in particular is a fit for you. Now, you could talk about location in terms of an urban environment that provides patient care to a certain demographic or to a certain population. That is absolutely great. Or similarly, a rural opportunity, if that's something that you're more interested in. You can also certainly talk about location in terms of proximity to family and to support networks. But again, you want that to be then a more kind of at the end, after you've already told them every reason why you're interested in their specific school, you could add in the location kind of towards the end. It's also important to think about not just what they can do for you, but also what you would contribute to their environment. So if you read your essay about why this school, and it reads kind of me, I want, you can give me, that makes it sound like a very one-way street. And you want to make sure that you're also letting them know what you can contribute to their environment and why this, again, would be a good fit for you both. Another question that gets asked pretty commonly is, can you tell us about the diversity that you would bring to this class? First and foremost, it's important to think broadly. We list several factors here. Any of these, your socioeconomic status, if you're a first-generation college student, maybe you pursued a slightly different course of study. Maybe you did something really unique in terms of your extracurricular experience. Those are all things that you could consider when it comes to thinking about what you bring to the class. But it is, again, important when you're saying, when they're asking what diversity do you bring, it's not because it makes anybody better if you can check off a box and kind of hold this internally. You want to reflect externally. So the question is really, why would your presence in the class elevate the learning environment or experience for those around you? So if you, for example, are a first-generation college student and you've had to struggle maybe in a different way to get through the collegiate environment, what might that be able to kind of contribute to the knowledge or the understanding of those that you're sitting in class with? So maybe it's, you could bring up, if you're talking about something like health literacy, well, is the form that they're that they're asking patients to fill out, what grade level is that written to? What if somebody has not gone to college? Would they still be able to read that? So you want to make sure that when you think about your diversity, it's not just that internal checkbox, but it's an external contribution that you would give to the rest of your class. Another common question is to tell us about a challenge or a difficult situation. Some of them will specifically say, we don't want to hear about anything academic. And we would definitely encourage you as well to think outside of the classroom with this. Now, it could be that academics was truly your greatest struggle, maybe because you have a learning disability, maybe because English is not your first language and adjusting to the speed of college was a little bit difficult. Certainly, if you had a significant academic challenge, you could absolutely talk about that. But for the most part, they don't want to hear about you got a B in one class, or you had a tough time understanding how to do a lab report when the grade in that class that you received was an A-. It just doesn't ring quite as true. So you want to talk about something that's real. And what do we mean by real? It could be a personal challenge. It could be maybe it was a RSO that you were involved with and the leadership of that RSO was not getting along and you had to navigate some really difficult personal conflict. They're really wanting to see something that kind of is outside of the classroom environment, and that gives them a little bit more of a sense for what you do and how you respond to a challenge or to a failure. It's important as you talk about it to make sure that any question mark or any flag is completely covered and sort of resolved. So if you're talking about a personal conflict, for example, you don't want to say, I just waited for it to blow over. My initial reaction was everybody's being, overly emotional, and so I just waited for everything to calm down. They're going to think about that and say, well, okay, what if you're having, a somewhat challenging interaction with a patient? Are you just going to wait for them to calm down, or do you have any skills or strategies that you're going to be using to try to navigate that relationship? So you want to make sure that any flag that gets raised is then answered or then lowered. Again, they're looking to see how do you overcome and endure through a challenge. So it's important to tell them about help that you may have received. Who did you reach out to? Did you just try to grin and bear it, which is not the greatest answer? Or did you work to overcome this challenge by educating yourself better about something, by asking others for advice, by learning more about personal conflict, or whatever that might be? You want to make sure that you're able to tell them what are the skills and strategies you used. The idea here is that if you start to struggle or if you start to fail in medical school, they want to see that you can get help. If you talk about something that is health related, that is absolutely fine to do. You just want to make sure, again, that you're able to give them a sense for why this particular issue, illness, injury is not going to unduly affect your medical school experience. So if it's something that is now managed with medication, or as long as you do X, Y, and Z physical therapy exercises a day, you're able to stay in control of it. You just don't want to say sort of, here are all the things that were challenging for me from an illness standpoint, and never tell them what the end result is. Is there anything else to add? So sometimes this question throws people off because it's very open-ended. There are a couple of ways to approach it. If you applied before you had spring grades, you could always use that space to give them your spring grades. If you haven't yet answered why this school in another essay question, you could certainly put why this school in that space instead. If you truly have nothing else to add and your application is pretty well covered and you feel like you told them everything you needed to in your secondary application and your primary application, you could just use that space to simply write a quick thank you so much for reading my application. It never hurts. You may remember at the very first seminar that we did, we told you guys to keep thanking all those around you who are kind of helping you get through this. A quick thank you just for your time and attention for my application is never a bad thing to say. So in terms of next steps, one is, regardless of the deadline that a medical school gives you, you should set for yourself about a 2-week turnaround time from when you receive the secondary to when you send it back. I would recommend keeping a spreadsheet with the dates. So for each medical school, when did you get the secondary and when did you turn it back? As you may have already started to realize, when it comes to this process, there can be a lot of anxiety. And so the dates can get a little haywire, and we could think something happened a week ago and it was really 2 weeks ago. We could think something happened yesterday and it was really a week ago. So that's something that is important to keep in mind so you stay on top of all the secondaries. Definitely edit, proofread, make sure you have the right school listed for every single secondary. The schools love it when you use their name because it helps them feel like it's not a generic answer, but obviously this can go haywire if you have the wrong school listed. So it's never a bad idea, to work on a couple of secondaries at the same time. Do one first, put it aside, do the next one, go back to that first one so that you can edit and proofread with a pretty fresh mind. Unfortunately, we can't read your secondary essays, partly because it should be your authentic self and partly because there's just too many. With well over 100 applicants every year times about 15 secondaries, usually 3 essays each, we just can't read these for you. So definitely enlist the support of family or friends, just again for that kind of proofreading help and making sure that you understand what you're sending and that there's no errors that are in place with that. Good luck. Stay focused. We know that the secondaries are an awful lot of work, but hopefully if you just take the time and keep pacing yourself through, they won't be too overwhelming. And just remember that from the secondary, next step is interview. So that's a really great opportunity to start thinking ahead and getting excited about the next step in your process. Oh, final thing, sorry. Anything in your application is fair game. So if you mention any sort of, anything that would fall into the typically quote unquote illegal questions for them to ask you. So no one can ask you your race or ethnicity. No one can ask you in an interview what your sexual orientation is. No one can ask you what your religion is or what your family structure is like. But if you bring it up in a secondary essay, now you have opened the door to that. So if you're talking about the death of a family member, if you're talking about a personal illness that you experienced, it is fair game for the interviewer to ask about. So definitely make sure that you stay, kind of aware of that. If you're putting something in a secondary that you could not talk about without crying, it's maybe not the best idea to use that example if you don't think that you'd be able to hold it together during an interview if they ask you the same thing. So just remember that whatever you put in your application is absolutely eligible to be asked about.